Hello, good evening, and thank you for joining us for our live climate change event tonight. My name is Joe Cullinane, and I'm the leader of North Ayrshire Council, and I'm going to host tonight's event. This is the second climate change event that the council has held. The first was actually the last in-person event that we held before lockdown last March. That night we had over 100 people in Saltcoats Town Hall. We had many good conversations at the tables, and the issues that were discussed now feature in the council's new climate change strategy, which we're here to formally launch this evening. Climate change is the biggest challenge of our time, and we hold tonight's discussion in the wake of last week's IPCC climate change report, which was described as Code Red for humanity. That report by leading climate scientists in the world, and importantly signed off by governments across the globe as well, was clear that the effects of global warming are with us now in every part of the world, and that's before we reach the 1.5 degrees of warming, which people often speak about. We're seeing the effects on our TV screens with the recent floods in places like Germany and Belgium, and the horrific fires in Greece, Turkey, in America and other parts of the world too. The effects of climate change are only going to get more severe with every extra bit of warming, and that's a scary thought. But the IPCC has repeated that it's not yet too late to secure a healthy planet for future generations, as long as we act now and act in a way that is adequate with the crisis that we face. That's why we're here tonight for this event. Clearly, the crisis we face requires a response on a far greater scale than one local authority, but we have an important role to play. I want North Ayrshire Council to show leadership in tackling climate change. The council's already cut our own carbon emissions by 45% compared to 2006 levels, but we've set out plans to become one of the first regions in the UK to reach net zero by the end of this decade. We're accelerating our response to climate change with recent announcements, including a £500,000 Green Jobs Fund to help local businesses cut their carbon emissions and create new green jobs, a tree planting programme that will plant 108,000 new trees across the region, a green participatory budgeting fund, which is going to help community groups and communities undertake environmental initiatives in their own areas. And we've agreed 2 council-owned solar farms, which are going to generate 2/3 of the council's energy. It's going to cut our carbon emissions by 850 tonnes a year. And crucially, it's going to provide a financial surplus of around £25 million. That's money that will then be reinvested in North Ayrshire. But to achieve our ambition to be a net zero region by 2030, we must go further and go faster. So tonight is about having a discussion on these next steps and to involve you, our residents in North Ayrshire, in that discussion. We've got some excellent speakers for you tonight, and I will introduce each of them in a moment as I invite them to speak on their own area of expertise. We want tonight's event to be participative, so we will be having a question and answer session later on. So please do contribute to tonight's discussion by commenting on the Facebook post, whether that be a question for me or a panel member, a general comment about climate change and the crisis that we face, or even just an idea that you want to share with myself and the panel. Our first speaker tonight is going to be Matthew Lawrence. Matthew is the founder and director of a think tank called Commonwealth. They focus on democratic ownership models for a sustainable economy. Matthew and the team at Commonwealth have done some great work on the Green New Deal, and he's also co-authored this excellent new book, A Planet on Fire, a manifesto for the age of the environmental breakdown. It's a great book. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Matthew's got to say tonight, and I would really like to thank him for joining us for tonight's event. So Matthew, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks very much, Joe, and thanks to the book club. I don't actually have one here, but yeah, it's funny. The title itself, "Planet on Fire," was sort of at the time we began writing it in 2018, 2019, was sort of a sort of catchy publishing style slogan, whereas now it just looks more and more like a sort of prophecy for what sort of every summer is going to look like in the global north for the next 50 years or so. So thank you very much for that introduction. As mentioned, Matthew Lawrence, Director of Commonwealth, not to be confused with Commonweal, although we also look into questions of commoning and sort of how do we sort of democratize our economy. And I'm going to sort of speak for 6 or 7 minutes or so, I think was the brief, around sort of what role does a green economy have, green recovery have in tackling the climate crisis? And I think, the sort of short answer would be, given, Code Red for Humanity, if it isn't a sort of green recovery, and if everything, in some ways we need to move away from siloing, we've got a green recovery and then the rest of the economy is just kind of normal and carbon intensive. If it isn't a green recovery, then that's a flashing symbol we had last week is going to sort of come to fruition pretty quick. The longer answer, I guess, I just want to touch on a few things, and I think it's a really it is a really opportune moment to meet, not least because of last week's, but also because the strategy, I think, is I just want to sort of take a moment to say, I think the strategy and the work you and all the team and the council are doing, and sort of everyone in the area are doing, is just really visionary and leading not just, I think, at the UK, but the world really, in terms of its ambition, the 2030 target, sort of scale and range of things you're doing on the net zero target, but also, of course, community wealth building is really, really exciting to see, and sort of prefiguring the type of change we need at a larger scale. I mean, I think most people on the call will have seen and sort of been up to date with the IPCC report last week, but it's worth, I guess, just touching on some of the key themes which then speak to the politics of a green recovery. So the obvious flashing symbol was the speed, the scale, and the injustice for the acceleration of climate crisis, and the interconnected sort of breakdown of biodiversity, of water tables, of sort of the Gulf Stream, of a whole set of things is going faster, more impactful, devastating more lives than we thought. So that's the sort of like urgent need to act, and why we do need a green recovery if we're going to tackle things. But I think the second thing is, to some degree the title Planet on Fire maybe leans into this, and so that's probably a fair self-critique, but it's that we shouldn't necessarily give in to sort of doomism and sort of, the apocalyptic, oh my God, everything's on fire, and we can't do anything. So I think a key lesson from last week, which should then feed into sort of how we organise, at a local level, at a national and an international level, at places like the sort of COP conference at Glasgow, is that the report set out a set of trajectories. There are very different pathways that we can emerge out of COVID-19 and sort of into the next decade, and that will have very significant sort of differing trajectories for life on Earth over the next century. And so that leads to the third point, really, which is that I think the key thing, what we stress in the book, what we stress in our work at Commonwealth, is that the climate crisis, and indeed all the internet-connected crises intermeshing with it, is fundamentally a crisis of politics. So we really know, and your strategy sets out many of these examples, we really know in many of the areas we need to decarbonize, the technical means to do it. We know we have the resources, the fiscal resources, the sort of, monetary firepower to do this. What we often lack is the political power, the political will, the political sort of coalitions, the sort of ambition, the social pressure to do that. And so I think that's, I think knowing that there are different trajectories, knowing that it's still in our hands is a really important sort of and positive thing to think about, and think about then how do we mobilize, politically to ensure that we have a green recovery, not a return to status quo. So I think the other thing I'd say is that, when we think about sort of green recovery, the obvious sort of thing we're recovering from is COVID. So, the climate crisis is coming into a set of other sort of interlocking and overlapping and compounding systems crises. So that's obviously a public health emergency in COVID-19. It's sort of ebbing and flowing, but, it's certainly not over. That, of course, overlaps with an economic crisis in which, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in Scotland, whether it's in the decency of work, the whole gamut, we know that sort of as an economy and an economic system, we need deep institutional change. And of course, we also need sort of, there's sort of deep social crises, whether that's the crisis of care, whether that's the, the crisis of, there's a whole series of crises I don't need to elaborate on. So I think when you look at those all together, we need a sort of systemic response to a systems crisis. And that systems, and the perfect opportunity is to sort of have a green recovery at scale. So by that, I think it's important to stress not just a real step change in investment. I think that's clearly true, that we need a sort of quantitative increase in the amount of money we spend on decarbonising technologies, on scaling green industries, et cetera, et cetera. But we also need a sort of structural qualitative shift, which I think the strategy alludes to really nicely, around how we organise, how we live together. Whether it's how we sort of our mobility systems, our food systems, our energy systems, the balance between leisure and work. There's a whole set of things that we need to think about as we sort of design and sort of mobilise for a green recovery. Should be at the heart of it. And I think within that, I think there's things that the UK government can do. There's things that the Scottish government can do. But I think in some ways, to end on, I think both those two institutions I just mentioned, to varying degrees, are kind of like I think we can see over, for example, the sort of Cambo issue. They're sort of like at best slow, at worst actively making the problem worse. But I think that makes it all more important that when we think about what is a green recovery, yes, we push at Holyrood and Westminster and beyond and at COP, etc. But we also take the chance now to begin to prefigure the type of systemic change we need at a local level. And so I think some of the things you and your team have put together in and around sort of how do you mobilize pension funds and green pension funds? How can you sort of have sort of publicly owned sort of companies, whether that's energy companies, whatever it might be, to begin to sort of decarbonize energy systems, thinking about sort of the circular economy at a local level, thinking about mobility systems at a local level. I think the key thing is that we know what would constitute a transformative green recovery. The reality is we're probably not going to get it at the scale and at the ambition, at least on the fiscal level. But the sort of hopeful thing is that we can begin to sort of weave together a mosaic. Not sure if that's the right sort of mixing my metaphors. Weave together sort of like a fabric from local ambition and scale and type of things you're pioneering, that I think can begin to embed what looks like a really transformative green recovery. So yes, I think green recovery, if we don't have a green recovery, we're not going to tackle the climate crisis. And if we don't tackle the climate crisis, then we're in trouble. So I think I would definitely point to really sort of focusing in on sort of green community wealth building as a sort of agenda that can anchor a transformative recovery.
No, thank you very much, Matthew. That was great, and just thank you to you and Commonwealth again for your continued support for the work that we're doing in community wealth building. As you know, your colleague Miriam is part of our expert advisory group, so we really appreciate Miriam's contribution so far to that work. So the climate emergency is clearly a global crisis, which I said earlier. It's affecting every part of the world, but we can absolutely think global and act local. And our next speaker, I think, will demonstrate some of that. Jude King is the project manager for Arran EcoSavvy, a community group based on the Isle of Arran with the aim of identifying and accomplishing environmental projects to benefit the island community, increase environmental sustainability and support sustainable living, whilst working towards a zero waste Arran. So Jude and Arran EcoSavvy are doing some excellent work, and I'm really looking forward to listening to you tonight, Jude. So I'll pass over to you now.
Thank you very much, Joe. I feel like you gave such a good introduction. I can skip my first part of my speech, but thank you very much for inviting me along to speak to you all tonight. As Joe said, I'm the project manager of Arran EcoSavvy. We're an environmental and community organization on the Isle of Arran, and we run carbon cutting projects here that tackle issues around food waste, support sustainable travel, help households move towards renewables and consume less energy. And we have a great community to work with here. I'm also involved in organizations such as Visit Arran and Arran Recovery Group and Arran Community Renewables. And I'd like to start off by saying that there are some fantastic organizations, individuals and initiatives happening within Arran, within North Ayrshire as a whole, that are tackling the environmental crisis and making a lot of movement in that. But so much more needs to be done in order to address the issues of the climate emergency that was declared by North Ayrshire Council in 2019, to be able to deliver the climate strategy that we're launching tonight, which is really exciting, and meet net zero by the targets that have been set. Earlier this year, I was sitting in my conservatory with my friend Emily having a cup of tea after a lovely walk in the Arran Hills. And a few minutes into our conversation, Emily looked out the window and pointed out a little whisper of smoke from some trees, maybe 500 meters away from my home. And at the time, I kind of brushed it off because only a week earlier I had seen a similar strand of smoke, and it had actually just been someone burning waste in their garden. So we carried on our trivial chit chat, but 20 minutes later, we turned to see billows of smoke and flames creeping up a hill. We ran outside to be joined by locals to watch this fire take over a hill. And as we watched our friends and the fire brigade on Arran frantically beat out the flames, we started to wonder, how far would this fire spread? How long would it go on for? And luckily for Arran, the fire did not spread that much. It stopped at the top of the hill, and no lives were lost, no livelihoods were lost, no houses were lost, and no possessions were lost. But as we look around the world, other fires have not been as merciful. So the question that I've been asked to answer today is, why is a drastic shift from the world as we know it today so important? Apart from the signs on our doorstep, such as dryness causing fires to spread, flooding around the island and around North Ayrshire, water shortages just this summer causing talk of hosepipe bans, and we saw many water tankers being brought onto the island. When we look further, there are more extreme and terrifying events happening. Wildfires have erupted around the world in Turkey, Italy, the US, Spain, France, Cyprus, Finland, Lebanon, Canada, and Greece. There has been severe flooding in Germany, China, Italy, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Hail bigger than tennis balls has rained down in northern Italy, and it's even snowed in Brazil. The IPCC tells us that without a doubt, these extreme climate events are being accelerated by human activity and what we are doing here on the planet. So I don't really need to stand here and tell you why acting on climate change is important for too much longer, because we're all going to end up really depressed and distressed and, quite frankly, terrified, because it is more severe than we ever have thought. What I do want to stress is that we are in such a privileged position to be able to mitigate, not only adapt like so many other countries are. We can do something, and we will do something, because there is power in community and collective action. And we have absolutely shown how amazing we can be when crisis hits. If we look back at the last year and how we pulled together through the pandemic, we saw volunteer networks spring up, deliver local food. You checked in on your neighbors. We cared, and we really pulled together as a community. And I guess what I want to stress tonight is that we need to start doing that now for the climate crisis, because although 2030, 2040, 2050 feels like a long time to act and do something, and as intangible as climate change might feel sometimes here in North Ayrshire, when it does arrive in the devastating way it's arriving in other places, it will be too late to act. So we have to act now, and we need to act like it's the emergency that we have declared. So the next question that's probably coming into your mind is, what can we do? Well, luckily we have some great panelists tonight that are going to give you some more detail on that. And whenever you wonder why you should choose low carbon travel over a high polluting car, or even worse, a plane, why you should choose local food over imported meals that cause deforestation, why you should insulate your homes and invest in renewables, why you should use your political voice for change, I want you to remember 3 reasons to care. So as flippant as it might sound, do you like coffee? Do you like chocolate and food and drink in general? Well, the climate crisis will mean food shortages. The extreme weather events make it harder and harder to grow food for an ever-growing population. And we had a bit of a taste of food shortages through the pandemic. The same goes for water shortages as climate change affects rainfall patterns, meaning both drought and flooding will become more common and more intense. And I'm going to pop a link to a flood prediction map into the video comment section, just so you can have a little, if you want, you can check out how flooding could potentially impact you within North Ayrshire over the next years and what we can do about it potentially. Secondly, do it because unless we show our government that we care with how we vote, with our actions, with what we choose to buy, consume, and entertain, they will continue to prioritize profits over people. And when we look around, we can see that that's already cost millions of lives globally. And with every moment that passes, it continues to cost more. COP26 is a fantastic opportunity to ramp things up. So that's number 2, care because your voice and your action can make a difference. Thirdly, if you're not going to do it for yourself or your own future, do it for the future of your loved ones. Maybe that's your friend, your partner, your child, your grandchild, your niece, your nephew. We will all be impacted by climate change. That is unequivocal. What I can't tell you is the level at which you will specifically be impacted, but who wants to take a risk on the lives of our loved ones when we do have this window of opportunity to act? And if you're thinking right now that you don't care about anyone specifically, or you don't care about people, at least do it for the animals, the polar bears, chimpanzees, the pandas, and all the animals that are facing extinction at a rapid rate. So the note that I really want to end on is just to say that the solutions are there, just as Matthew was saying earlier. We have the technical expertise, we have the resources, we need the will, and we need to show that we want change. We have some amazing organizations within North Ayrshire, amazing initiatives and individuals, and North Ayrshire Council has shown fantastic commitment to tackling the climate crisis. So let's support that. And thank you for coming along tonight and giving me a chance to speak. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Jude, and thank you to Arran EcoSavvy for everything that you're doing on the island. I think the island represents a sort of unique opportunity for us to take forward some of the green initiatives that we're likely to talk about tonight. So I'm looking forward to seeing the next steps for Arran EcoSavvy, and certainly we'll be looking to hopefully support you on your next steps in your journey. The next speaker tonight is Paul Toohey of Strathclyde University. Paul was one of the experts who contributed to the low carbon building standards strategy for Scotland, which I think is going to be a really important strategy for us as we tackle the climate crisis over the next few years. He's also the project lead for the EU Smart Integrated Energy Systems, and he's published over 75 papers on energy transition. Paul, I'm really looking forward to hearing from you tonight, particularly on the importance of new low carbon technology. So I will pass the floor to you.
Yep, thanks for giving me the opportunity. It's great to be here. And I'd like to just sort of second, what's been said up to this point. We have the solutions. It's not all bleak. We have the solutions, but we're also really prone to making incredible missteps. We have the solutions, but we're making bad choices often. Things like biomass and biofuels, we took a huge step into that, and then only 10 years later we decide that, well, that wasn't such a good idea because we're actually turning huge forested areas into cropping lands and destroying the ecology, releasing the carbon that was embedded there. And now it's all about planting trees. So we really shouldn't be burning trees. Similar arguments, waste to energy. Waste to energy, that's really fossil fuel power. And in parallel with that, we're talking about capturing carbon, but we're burning the carbon, we're burning the plastic waste in these waste energy plants to create electricity, which is basically we're burning fossil fuels and releasing the carbon into the environment. So that makes no sense whatsoever, but we're still doing it. And now the latest is to do waste to hydrogen, and there are plants being proposed for that. And again, someone will say, okay, yeah, if we do that, then how do we capture the carbon from the waste to hydrogen plant? Well, actually, you've got the carbon to begin with, and the plastic bottles you're going to be burning to make the. So we're just like really ridiculous at making bad choices. So that's one thing that we have to get a lot better at. There are some terrific examples of solutions, though, and a lot of those that we look at have come up from the ground level through community groups. So if you look at the island of Egg, Fintray, Findhorn, and there are loads and loads of examples like that, where community groups have taken control, put in place a renewable energy system, created local jobs and infrastructure. Everyone becomes energy literate. Everyone starts thinking about energy and carbon and the environment, sustainability. That's the solution, is to have the correct approach, a considered approach, not monetizing things that aren't correct, and not creating industries that destroy the planet, which is the current path. So we have a lot of choices, and community groups and councils and engagement with this whole technology choice is key. So it's great to see the North Ayrshire Council, taking a really proactive approach. What we really want to do with the energy transition is to create a healthy, happy, productive environment. And we want to create a great place for ecology, for nature, and a great place to live and a great place to work. And we can do that through these energy transition technologies and address a lot of the issues that we have with noise, with pollution, with lack of security and safety around roads and transport networks and things like that. And we have all the solutions. We just need to think carefully about them and have a joined up approach. So with everything, avoid energy use. That's the lowest carbon thing you can do. Secondly, then you minimize energy use by using efficient systems. And thirdly, you make sure that all of the supply side is 100% renewable. And if you do that, then that's the best you can do. And in parallel with that, if you minimize your demands, make them all satisfied by clean renewables, then you're not impacting on the planet, and you're not consuming space, you're not putting pollutants into the environment, and we can slow down the catastrophic climate change that's coming at us at the moment. There are great solutions. If we think about transport, for example, it's about a third of our energy use and a third of our carbon emissions. So how do we avoid that? Well, if we just get back to active travel, local 15-minute neighborhoods, get kids so they can walk to school. I mean, kids being driven to school in large fossil fuel vehicles is just like, it's just horrendous. We need to get back to something that is actually healthier for people if they walk, get a bit of exercise, count their steps. So walking, cycling, e-bikes, e-bus, apps that enable people, and most importantly, safe routes around our schools, around everything we want to do. The Mayor of Paris has got a terrific example of how to do that at scale. So that's avoidance for the transport paradigm, and it'll make us all fitter, healthier, happier, create nice corridors with trees, take away parking spaces, use them more productively, all of that kind of stuff. With traffic and transport, then we want to minimize the amount of energy we expend. So we don't want, so if we think about petrol vehicles, they're about 25% efficient in terms of energy. The energy you put in the petrol, only 25% of that drives you forward. The rest goes out in terms of heat, waste, pollution, and other emissions. If you have an EV, it's 90% efficient straight away. So that's 3 times more energy efficient. You use a third of the energy to go the same distance in an EV. And it's a much, much simpler contraption. So there you go, minimize the energy use in terms of building the vehicle, and minimize the energy use for transport. So electric vehicles part of the solution, but we don't want to replace big SUV type electric vehicles. We want to have more agile type of technologies in terms of small electric vehicles, maybe shared, car share, that type of stuff. Look for solutions that minimize the energy use. technology. I used to work in electronics before coming into this field, and there everything got smaller over time. But if we look at transport, these big aggressive vehicles get bigger and more aggressive because it persuades people that it's dangerous on the roads, and it is with those large vehicles. So they need a big vehicle to be safe on the road that's dangerous because of the large vehicles. It's just horrendous. It's just we need to think differently about that and create safe spaces. And that's a big role in minimizing energy use. And we need to create infrastructure that lets people go to small vehicles and maybe share vehicles, things like that. And then we want to make sure the supply for the vehicles is 100% renewable. If you think about houses, the minimization piece for energy use is going to be to retrofit them, make them more energy efficient, but also healthier. So when you're doing the makeover, make sure it's with healthy materials, that you get a ventilation system that improves the air quality, no dampness, no pollutants, no asthma. We can do it. We have the solutions, and that minimizes the energy use. Just make over the housing stock and do it right. Do it once, do it right, do it healthy. And connect as you're making the makeover. Make sure you've got all these active travel routes and green space and ecology and all of that. So we have the solutions. Then if we think about the energy supply in houses, then we want heating, obviously, and power. So the heating, if you use a boiler, it's 90% efficient. If you use a heat pump, it's 300% efficient. For every 1 unit of electricity, you get 3 units of heat. So that's already, you're reducing the energy demand by a third by doing that. And then, again, we always think there's a barrier to using heat pumps. And there is a bit of an issue because we don't have the economy of scale yet in that industry. But we all have 2 heat pumps in our house, in our fridge and our freezer. And we don't bat an eyelid at that. So, you know, the technology's there. It can be reliable. It is not a major issue. We have solutions. And then the last thing we need to do is make sure that all the supply comes from clean renewables. And that's going to be wind, particularly in Scotland, but also solar. It has a role to play. And the cost curves and the embodied energies in developing those things is reducing, and the embodied carbon in those technologies is reducing. And then hydrogen will have a role to play, and we can be world leaders in green hydrogen. We don't want to be doing blue or grey hydrogen because they're fossil fuel based. So, and we have in Scotland huge amounts of green hydrogen potential. Where it should be used is to back up the electricity system to enable these other technologies which are simple and effective. So things like a hydrogen power station at Hunterston or at Peterhead, something like that, that takes the wind energy when there are surpluses, it stores it, and then it generates back when there's no wind and no solar. And those occasions when there's no wind and no solar will be minimized by the fact we're a connected grid with the rest of Europe. So really, we just need to get organized. We need to make the right decisions. We need to see through the propaganda from different solution providers who may not be giving you the solution you need, that may not be the right thing for the planet and the ecology. Select the correct technologies and then let them implement at scale so that they become effective for everyone. Yeah, that's my note of optimism there. And I think that people are at the core of it, and we need to have people engaged, and the council's the vehicle for that in North Ayrshire, along with the other community groups. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was really fascinating, and I'm sure as we get into the questions section, there'll be a number of questions that will come up around some of the previous decisions that you were referring to, and sources of renewable energy and what's the most effective and most efficient in the fight against climate change. So really fascinating to hear your input tonight, and I'm sure that'll generate a lot of interest. Last but not least, in terms of our speakers tonight, we have Aaron McDonald. It's been the activism of young people, I think, that's drove the climate change up the political agenda in recent years. Aaron has been one of our members of the Scottish Youth Parliament in North Ayrshire for a number of years, and he's involved in a number of community groups. Aaron, I'm looking forward to hearing from you about the importance of climate change to young people, so I'll let you make your contribution now.
Thanks, Joe. And as Joe said, my name's Aaron McDonald. I'm the member of the Scottish Youth Parliament for Kirringham South here in North Ayrshire, and I'll be answering how can young people fight the climate crisis. So I'm not going to lie, I've spent the last 2 weeks thinking about this question, and it's quite hard to think what way young people can get involved but also make a difference. And when I first joined the SYP 4.5 years ago, we were talking about climate change, we were talking about a climate emergency, and we were talking about the climate crisis, and that was 4.5 years ago. And in that time, what have we actually seen? Well, on a national level, we declared a climate emergency. But have we seen the investment in green municipal transport? Have we seen the steps towards making public transport free, accessible and reliable? Have we seen councils giving funding to support community initiatives? Have we seen mass replanting that we need for the climate emergency? Have we seen a ban on fossil fuels, and have we seen a ban on new contracts to dig them up out of the ground? Have we seen a transition plan released to take us away from the current system? And have we seen a realisation that we're not only in the grips of a climate emergency, but on the total collapse of humanity? And most of these answers to these questions is no or very little, and that's worrying. However, locally, since the council declared a climate emergency, we've seen steps forward. Things like the solar panel scheme that I can say is working because they're on my house roof right now. We're soon to see a second solar farm owned by the council. They're upgrading homes and they're bringing people's voices in. And that's what matters, having a sense of community, because it's not just about policymakers and decision makers making these decisions in different areas across the country. It's about all of us being involved in that process and having our voices heard and making those day-to-day changes. So what can young people do? Well, my main focus on this is what you can do right now watching this and how you can get involved. So what do I mean by get involved? Well, it's very, very simple. It's stand up, speak out and stay focused. Because we look back at what we've achieved and we've come together as young people, we've achieved change. Whether that's been Black Lives Matter, stopping things like Dawn Raid, supporting people in our communities from the LGBT community to making our streets safer, especially for women and girls. And when we come together, change happens, and the same is happening now for climate justice. Climate justice will only be achieved when people come together and build movements. And that's been happening right across the country and right across the globe because young people and people from all different backgrounds have been coming together like never before. The last year and a half of this pandemic has showed us, if it's showed us one thing, it's how strong we are when we've come together as communities. This November, the world's eyes will be on Scotland. World leaders from across the globe will just be up the road, or just up the track, I should say, in Glasgow. And there's so much happening right now that you can get involved in. There's so many different events like tonight, asking you to come along, ask questions or get involved. And many are happening here at home in Ayrshire as well. So if you even just search COP26 or 50 days till COP26 or 25 days, something like that, an event will come up. And how you can get involved is go and have your voice heard and say enough is enough. Because previous generations were told and they didn't listen. Previous generations were warned and they did not act. So this isn't an emergency that has came out of the blue and it's just snuck up on us. The Code Red for Humanity has been years and generations in the making and nothing has happened. So you can join your community council, join a local litter picking group to make grassroots changes, or join a local group in general. Join a group that's talking about environmental, political and social justice. If you're at university, join a society that's talking about the change we need, because that's how we'll make change. It's when we come together, when we're unstoppable. When we discuss change, we can't just discuss it, we need to act on it and we need to do it together. So this is my final event, Joe, as a member of the Scottish Youth Parliament. So if I had one message to young people before I step down tomorrow, it'd be this. When they tell you to sit down, stand up and stand tall. When they tell you to shut up and quiet, speak up, speak loud and shout the never like you have before. And when they tell you to move on and give up, stand strong, because never ever will we give up or give in until change happens. And I can't wait to see what questions come in later in this event. Thanks, Joe.
Thank you very much, Aaron. And I know the Scottish Youth Parliament have described you standing down as your retirement. So at the ripe old age of 19, I hope you get more free personal time and leisure time in your retirement. But no, thank you very much for everything that you've done as an MSYP over the last 4 and a bit years. And as you can see, I know that you've been a really strong advocate for young people in the area. So thank you very much for that, Aaron, and for your contribution tonight. So I'm going to move on to the Q&A section. You can still submit questions on the Facebook post, make comments, any ideas that you've got as well to tackle the climate emergency would be really great, and we'll put them to the panel as we go through this. Paul, I said earlier on we would probably have some questions around your comments about sources of energy. There's actually a couple of questions had come in before tonight on that sort of area. So like be a bit multifaceted. So just give me 2 minutes and I'll go through some of it. There was a question about, does hydrogen provide a better solution to green energy storage? There was the question about the natural resources that are required to produce batteries, for example, not just batteries in terms of storing renewable energy, but also electric vehicles, etc. There was also, as an addition to that, the question about the amount of concrete, for example, that's involved in sort of wind turbines and other various forms of renewable energy generation, both in terms of access roads and its construction. So I did say to you earlier on that you'd made an interesting comment about learning from mistakes, and I think you'd mentioned in particular biomass. You spoke about waste to energy, and then you've got these questions here about hydrogen and some of the other sources of renewable energy. So in your opinion, what is the most efficient form of renewable energy? What's your comments on hydrogen? You made some comments earlier on. Where do you think public investment should be get into? And I think the final bit of that would be, do we have enough grid capacity if we are to meet the challenges of generating enough renewable energy to transition away from fossil fuels as well?
Yeah. So yeah, I guess there are some good points there. I guess that people were talking about the natural resources and barriers and EVs. So let's just think, I guess that on concrete and wind turbine bases, I guess that needs to be carefully examined and minimized. And the embodied energy in concrete, I think, is something like 7% of the entire world's carbon emissions into concrete, but there are lower carbon forms of concrete. And there's a lot of research into that. But the embodied carbon and the embodied energy and everything we do needs to be accounted for and accounted for rigorously so that we do the right things. But offsetting all of the production and all of the other concrete that would go into the construction of power stations, nuclear power stations, gas power stations, is a wind turbine is much lighter in terms of its environmental impact, and the fuel source there is non-carbon emitting. It's 100% non-carbon emitting. All of the wind turbines are being recycled, and so should the concrete bases be. What's happening is that wind turbine sites used to have 2 megawatt wind turbines on them, like you see at Whiteleys, and that same pad, that same site, can be reutilized for a 7 megawatt wind turbine when it's being repowered. And that repowering process is something that's coming through the pipeline as we speak. I guess grid capacity, yes, we're putting in grid capacity. I think there's a large interconnector now going from Hunterston down the west coast to Wales, and there's another, the Beauly to Denny power line was one, which it would be nicer if it was a buried power line rather than something as obtrusive as it is. And then there's another set of interconnectors being put down the North Sea to pick up wind energy. And the Dogger Bank in the centre of the North Sea that used to be land is shallow water between here in Scotland and England and Denmark, Norway. Sorry, no, it's actually more between us and the Netherlands. And it's been purposed for offshore wind turbines, and it's going to be an interconnection hub between the UK and all the other countries in Europe effectively. So at times when the wind isn't blowing here, it'll be blowing somewhere else. There's a huge generation potential. So wind is the big ticket item, and Scotland's ideally placed as a wind generation site. We have a lot of shallow water, which is being utilised at the moment, but we've also got the floating turbines, which are going to, there's already an array out off Aberdeen of floating turbines. So that opens up the potential to put them out off the west coast where there's deeper water, off Orkney and Shetland. So really the possibility for us to be a major exporter of hydrogen, green hydrogen, entirely from renewables, is very large, and that's a future pathway for us. So green hydrogen, don't go down the path of fossil fuel-based hydrogen. As we've seen this week, there have been a lot of Stanford and other universities have done accounting, and the methane emissions that are emitted by the fossil fuel industry, you look at the flare-offs and you look at all the other sort of sources and leaks of methane, that's a much stronger greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide, and if you account for that, you know, using the fossil fuel route to go to hydrogen isn't a good route to follow. So everyone will recognise ultimately that green hydrogen is the solution. Scotland can produce masses of green hydrogen, more than we need. We just need it to balance the wind that we've got anyway naturally, and we can have PV. There's an interesting gap. Sometimes when you get gaps in the summer, on the Isle of Egg, they found this, they have hydro plus wind plus PV, and they found that in the summer, which is their peak tourist season, that sometimes the wind doesn't blow and the rain doesn't fall, just occasional years, and then the PV saves their bacon because it comes on in the June timeframe and just fills the gap. So PV has a role to play in Scotland as well. But yeah, we have a great position. Tidal's another thing that's up and coming, but it's a lot more expensive, and Scotland's got something like, I don't know, 30% of Europe's tidal resource. So we're ideally situated for natural renewable technologies. And the challenge for us is then to utilise them in the best way. I guess that people have talked about fossil fuels and using carbon capture and storage. I guess that that's yet to be really delivered in a way that is benign for the planet. And that industry has lots of ancillary emissions that would need to be taken into account for that. And there is no basis for that. We don't need that in Scotland, given the amount of renewable resource we have. So,
thanks very much, Paul. That was great, and I'm sure it'll trigger more comments as we go on. I'm going to move on and bring maybe you in, Jude. I think some of your contribution got some positive comments on Facebook, including I think you'd said about working with residents in Arran around insulation of homes. So there's been some questions around how do we make sure that we're able to insulate our homes. I mean, the council is doing some insulation with our own stock and we'll support our tenants, but obviously there's a whole market out there in terms of homeowners and private renters as well. So how do we make sure that it's easy for households to insulate their homes? And also I'm going to ask an additional question, if that's all right, Jude, and it's around what you'd said about reducing waste. And I know in Arran, there's been a lot of work done in terms of reducing waste, and actually the island got plastic-free community status a couple of years ago. So I don't know if you can maybe say a wee bit about that as well.
Yeah, that's fine. So in terms of insulating homes, we've run several projects which gave households advice around how to reduce consumption of energy and make their make homes more efficient. And whilst there are lots of households that wanted to embrace all the advice that we're giving in terms of renewables and insulation, the big barrier is cost, especially because Arran has a notoriously old housing stock, and it's really costly to be able to insulate properly. As well as that, getting tradespeople to do these things and experienced people do that is a challenge as well. So I suppose more investment and resource put towards homeowners being able to do that, and people that even rent or occupy houses being able to make those changes would be welcome. So more schemes around that, because we're giving the advice that everyone wants to be able to embrace it, but there's big barriers there. So investment in that would be really good, and we'd see a huge reduction in carbon emissions if we did that. In terms of plastic-free status, we have some great organizations, and the young people in school, primary schools, actually led that campaign through Think About Plastic, which is a great organization here on Arran. We work very closely with Coast as well, which they protect our marine environment and have some great initiatives around that. So yeah, we're constantly trying to reduce waste, plastic waste. EcoSavvy has a secondhand shop, and we sell eco products through that, so individuals can reduce their own plastic waste. But what would be really welcomed on Arran would be green composting initiatives, food waste initiatives, because right now we don't have that on Arran at all. So that's where we would really see some great changes if we would be able to create facilities for that. So that could be the next step, and that could help us maybe accelerate all of this. So yeah.
No, great. Thanks very much, Jude, for that contribution. Matthew, I'm going to bring you in now. There was a question submitted in advance of this evening. I've spoke about the council-owned solar farms already, but the question was around, is it better for municipal ownership or is it better for community ownership, social enterprise ownership? For example, renewable energy, what's more in line with community wealth building and the approach that we're taking to the economy here in North Ayrshire? And I wonder if I can just add on to the end of that, because you've mentioned it in your book and you've mentioned it tonight, the concept of green community wealth building. What do you mean by green community wealth building, and what does that add to the approach taken to community wealth building in other parts of the world so far?
Yeah, really interesting set of questions. On the first, I think this is a really interesting, it is a really interesting book in general, actually, starting again by this local Andreas Malm, called Fossil Capital, which looks at how this sort of energy profile of particular energies kind of then construct particular forms of economy, forms of sort of politics around it. And he looks at actually the emergence of the fossil-powered economy in the Industrial Revolution in the UK. And basically, like, the concentrated nature of fossil fuels lends itself to privatized ownership, very big concentrated ownership, corporate power, etc., etc. Whereas, of course, if you look to the flow of, wind, wave, solar power, it's by its nature something of the commons. It's very, I'm sure people will try, but it's hard to privatize the air. It's hard to sort of assetize sunshine. It's very hard to sort of, take it into a very financialized, extractive form of ownership. So then that lends itself very much to a much more pluralistic, decentralized and democratic sort of institutional sort of set of arrangements around ownership and governance. Whether it's, in some ways, I think, as a rule, we should have a rule of not having a rule necessarily, and being sort of, see what does each place need, what does each community need, what's the geography, what's the sort of capital requirement of the wind farm, whatever it might be. So I don't think we should have a sort of hard and fast, well, it should always be community, it should always be municipal. I mean, I think, one might well be, we've developed this thing called, the public commons partnership model. And we've looked at that mainly in terms of land and housing, but it's essentially where you have the public, in this place municipal ownership, gets together with the commoners, which would be sort of potentially community ownership, and there's sort of joint investment, mutual governance, mutual ownership. So that might well be the type of thing where you can have sort of a democratically accountable stake in terms of the municipal authority, like anchoring, providing some sort of startup capital, but then the community, controls where the surplus goes, gets a flow of the income, etc., etc. Certainly, I do think I saw a study the other day, which I can't quite remember the details on, but it was something along the lines of community-owned wind farms and renewable projects in general get something like 28 times return to people living within the geography of the energy system relative to sort of investor-owned and controlled wind farms. So clearly, I think we shouldn't necessarily end up splitting the difference so much between municipal versus community or cooperative, etc., when actually sort of both of those have real advantages relative to sort of an investor-led and heavily financialized approach. On the green community wealth building, I mean, I think, you know, it slightly goes back to my first point in the sense, like, we need to move, which actually speaks against myself, but in some ways move away from a siloing of like, we've got a green recovery and then we've got the rest of the economy. You know, everything has to become, you know, greenness should in some ways dissolve itself over the next decade if we're successful, in the sense that everything increasingly has to be green, quote unquote, and sort of, you know, within 10, 15 years, it will, you know, there won't be, we might talk of some brown, you know, assets and ways of living that sort of still live, but actually essentially green will just become, you know, you don't sort of talk about, you naturalize things that you just have been around and sort of become normalized. So in that sense, maybe it shouldn't be called green community wealth building, because community wealth building should be green. But I guess what I do mean is that some of the levers can be used not just to sort of grow, circulate and retain wealth in communities, but can link up with the sort of decarbonisation and a just transition that sort of speaks to sort of economic and ecological justice. So, you know, and I think some of the, you know, Paul mentioned some of the sort of supply chains, and obviously it's a live issue with BIFAB, etc. But, you know, we could be thinking about green industrial strategies linked to community wealth building that can, you know, create good unionised jobs in place, and what are the levers that can work there. It can be about, you know, not just, you know, having municipally owned bus companies, but making sure they're net zero, but then also thinking about the multimodal transport ways you can encourage, you know, sort of the 15-minute neighborhoods and towns that, again, Paul mentioned. It's about, you know, sort of working with, you know, some of the, you know, stuff that Jude's been talking about around sort of, you know, rewilding, and thinking about a much more sensitive relationship to place and nature in sort of community wealth building strategies when we think about land, housing, etc., etc. So basically, I think it's really just thinking systematically about, in all the areas of community wealth building, what are the levers we have, not just to sort of retain and sort of grow wealth in communities, but do so in a way that's ecologically just and sustainable.
Well, thank you very much, Matthew, for that response. You mentioned there sort of transport and municipal bus ownership is one model that you spoke about, but there has been a question come in about electric car sharing schemes, which again I know have been really successful in other areas, particularly in cities, and I think it would be worthwhile looking at how that sort of model would be able to operate in a more rural maybe setting like North Ayrshire. So yeah, absolutely, Sandra, something that we should absolutely be exploring as we take the strategy forward. But maybe I'll bring in Aaron on the transport issue, because I'm sure it will be of importance to young people, how you get about your local communities, how you maybe access labour market opportunities, etc. So we've had the discussion about the transition to electric vehicles. There's that bit about public transport, active travel. As a young person, where do you think we need to go in terms of cutting carbon emissions from transport? What do you think young people are looking for as a sort of policy solution to the climate emergency on transport?
I think so. In my role as an MSIP, I was involved in the TERR committee, so the Transport, Environment and Rural Affairs Committee. I was the convener of that for a year and a half, and our main focus was active travel, but also sustainable travel, and about how to encourage young people to use public transport more. It's about making it accessible. It's about making it reliable, not waiting for a bus and 3 turning up at once. It's about making it affordable as well, because it's not just about sort of transport in general. It links everything up. It's by using greener transport, you're helping the environment, but you can also save money, and how you work together to sort of get places. I think electric vehicles are great, but they're very expensive, and I know a lot of young people would love to own an electric vehicle, but they simply can't afford it. So it's about making things, when we're transitioning to a greener economy, making them accessible but also reliable, as well as more cheaper. It's about making being green cheaper, so more people can do it. It's a social, about a class issue as well. It's quite easy to do a lot of green things when you've got the sort of less worries in life, but when you're trying to match the bills at the end of the month, you're probably going to go for the cheaper option rather than thinking about your carbon emissions. So it's about making things accessible for everyone instead of just sort of making things greener, but forgetting about the cost behind them.
No, thank you very much, Aaron. I think that was a good point you made there. We're getting close to the end of time, but there is a question that I do want to ask, which was around carbon capture. And the question was, carbon capture scares me. What does the panel think of that? I think in addition to that question, there has been some comments all the way through about some big sort of ex-industrial sites in North Ayrshire, which we have quite a number of, given our industrial heritage and the deindustrialisation we've seen in the 1980s. Some of that is obviously get some environmental assets and benefits, but they're privately owned, and there's always the push for these private investors and private development on some of these sites. So we did have a carbon capture, for example, proposal a number of years ago at Hunterston, which I think had actually generated the largest number of objections to applying an application in Scottish history, because the carbon capture was being added to a clean coal plant in terms of the proposal. And I'm not sure how clean coal can ever be. But I suppose that twin track of carbon capture, is that part of the solution? And I know that Paul will probably have a view on that. But then that question about sort of the interests of capital and business against the interests of protecting the environment, and some of the challenges that we always have. And Matthew, you mentioned earlier on the current situation at Campbell. And I think that's a really good example, isn't it, of people looking to make some money off drilling for new oil sites in the north of Scotland. But what is the environmental impact of that? So I think there's probably two tracks there, and I'm sure you'll want to come in, Paul, but I'll bring in anybody else who wants to maybe make a contribution after you.
Yeah, I think the carbon capture, for me, it was Donald Trump that did the sort of clean coal kind of initiative, and you can create hydrogen from coal, and then you're left with some residues. There are other gases that are given off as well that you release into the environment. And then, yeah, his whole thing was, if you combust hydrogen as well, if you combust it in a power plant, you've got to be careful, because you create nitrous oxides, and which are a greenhouse gas again, and then you can combust it in oxygen only. And if you do electrolysis, you create oxygen and hydrogen, then you can combust it when you need it from those two and not create nitrous oxides. So there are solutions. They're not fossil fuel related though. It's again, electrolysis from green energy generation would be the solution. Carbon capture, every bit of plastic we've got is carbon, and putting it into some sort of deep repository would be carbon capture right there. Leaving it in the ground's carbon capture. I guess I just see the technology solutions that don't involve the emitting carbon into the environment and creating global warming. So I think we should stick to that track and leave, carbon capture is trees, carbon capture is peat. We shouldn't be ploughing up peat, destroying the peat, making the emissions to plant trees, to burn, to make more emissions. It's just crazy. And you can go a walk north of Glasgow at Carbeth. You go a walk up a lovely hillside. It's a moss, sphagnum moss. It's been ploughed for tree planting. There's a CHP plant on with the landowner. It's burning the trees. Now, this is perfectly good carbon capture into the logs, and then they're burning it to release, so we have vectors that will put more carbon and capture carbon. We've got to do the right ones, which respect nature, enhance natural sinks for carbon, and extracting fossil fuels and making plastics and burning the plastics. And then sometime in the future, some magical carbon capture technology will come along to solve all our problems. That's not going to happen. And it's much, much easier to do the right thing now.
Okay, thanks, Paul. That was a really interesting response. Does anybody else want to come in on any of those two questions? Matthew?
Yeah, I mean, definitely echoing what Paul says. I mean, if you said like, wow, we had this incredible new technology, it sort of like self-sustains itself, it sucks carbon out of the air, blah blah blah, and you're like, oh, it's a tree or whatever. It's in some ways like there's branding around of things that like we sort of overcomplicate things. And I guess the people who have got an interest in overcomplicating things and being like, well, let's keep the status quo going, and then we'll come up with a solution down the road rather than deploying at scale the technologies and solutions we have today, obviously some very entrenched vested interests, which then slightly leads to the Cambo point, which is that, I mean, I guess, so long as as long as the energy companies are for-profit corporations, traded on, publicly traded or sort of state-owned entities, but whose mission is to make profits, so long as it is more profitable to invest in fossil fuel extraction and production relative to renewables, which is definitely the case right now and is likely to remain so forever because of the economics of the two, partly going back to that stock versus flow point. You're going to struggle to get these, well, you're not going to get these companies to exit at the speed and scale we need. So we need to either transform the underlying property relations, or we need to make it unprofitable relative to investing in renewables. And so there needs to be it's the sort of seeing this sort of incredibly awkward, sort of S&P sort of dancing around it and Labour dancing around it, and just thinking the sort of approach to sort of the North Sea is indicative of a wider approach, which is just not taking the nub issue seriously, which is in sort of the energy transition in particular. If you're relying on for-profit corporations in a world in which the regulatory, fiscal, property relations world means that it's more profitable to produce fossil fuel power than renewables, then we're on a hiding to nothing. So I think there's these deep structural questions that we need to sort of address.
Thanks for that, Matthew. Jude or Aaron, you want to add anything before we wrap up?
No, kind of just echo what others have said. I think I'm getting some feedback. Yeah, just basically when the government invests in making the lowest carbon option the most appealing one, that's when we're going to see real change. That's all, basically. That's my final point. It's just agreeing with what people have said.
No, great, thanks, Jude. And Aaron, I think you were going to come in.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would say is Cambo was a perfect example of young people speaking truth to power. I think the fact that we're talking about Cambo in an event like this is because the young people decided to question decision makers in the streets, and I think we wouldn't have seen that happen if young people hadn't came together like they have been since all the different fiascos that have been happening over the pandemic.
No, thank you, Aaron, for that. And as I said earlier on, I think young people have absolutely been at the forefront of pushing climate change up the political agenda. So I'm sure people like yourself will continue to hold elected members like myself's feet to the fire over the next few years. So I'm looking forward to that, even if you're not continuing as the MSYP for the area. Listen, thanks very much to everybody who's been on the panel tonight. I really appreciate your time. Your contributions have been great. I think we have had some good engagement from local residents online. Unfortunately, there is questions and comments that are still on Facebook that we've not been able to kind of cover, but we will try our best to try and respond to your comments after the event tonight. I mean, I think we're going to have to continue these conversations over the next few years. We've set a really challenging target for net zero by 2030. It will require a lot of action from the council, but we'll need to work with local businesses, we'll need to work with local community groups like our EcoSavvy, we'll need to work with our young people in terms of climate literacy and adding it to the curriculum, etc. So really up for the challenge that lies ahead, and looking forward to continuing these conversations and working with you over the next few years. So look out for the next opportunity for you to participate. We are looking at creating a steering group to take forward our new strategy to drive forward the change that we need to see in North Ayrshire, and I'll be looking for the opportunity for people to maybe apply to join that steering group and contribute, so keep an eye out for that. And as I said earlier on, we're also in the process of working on a green participatory budgeting process, so there will be some funding available for local groups to bid for to take forward environmental projects in your own area, which will make a big difference, I think, in terms of the climate crisis. So look out for that as well. But thank you everybody for tonight. Thank you very much to the speakers, and looking forward to continuing the conversation over the coming months and years. So thank you.